People think the worst thing that can happen to an empath is betrayal. They think the deepest wound is being lied to, manipulated, abandoned, or taken for granted. But they are wrong. The most dangerous part isn't what happens to an empath when they are hurt. The most dangerous part is what happens after. Because there comes a moment, usually years later, when something inside them changes forever. Not loudly, not dramatically, not with revenge, not with rage, but with a terrifying kind of clarity. A clarity so profound that the people who once benefited from their kindness no longer recognize them. A clarity that transforms pain into perception. A clarity that turns emotional survival into psychological power. And the truth is that transformation scares people. Because when an empath finally becomes unstoppable, everyone who depended on their self-sacrifice suddenly loses their influence. The true horror begins when the person who spent their life understanding everyone else finally begins understanding themselves. Stay with me, because what happens next changes everything. Chase Hughes discovered something most people never realize. Human beings do not simply suffer forever. The psyche has its own survival mechanisms, its own hidden balancing systems, its own invisible laws. And according to Jungian psychology, there comes a point when the unconscious refuses to tolerate imbalance any longer. Jung called this tendency psychological compensation. When one side of the personality becomes overdeveloped, the neglected side eventually demands expression. And empaths often become the perfect example of this phenomenon. For years, they become compassion without boundaries, understanding without protection, forgiveness without limits, giving without receiving. They become so focused on everyone else's needs that they slowly disappear from their own lives. Hughes understood something terrifying about this process. The traits we suppress never truly disappear. They wait. They gather strength. They evolve in darkness. And eventually they return. Jung called part of this process shadow integration. The return of the forgotten self. The resurrection of qualities abandoned in the pursuit of acceptance. And when that return finally happens, the transformation is so profound that it often looks like an entirely different person has emerged. But the truth is much stranger. The unstoppable empath was always there, hidden beneath years of self-abandonment, waiting for permission to exist. Most people never see the suffering that creates this transformation. They only witness the outcome. They see confidence, boundaries, calm detachment, strength. What they never see are the years spent carrying emotional weight that was never theirs to carry. Empaths become emotional sponges. They absorb tension from rooms before words are spoken. They detect pain hidden beneath smiles. They sense disappointment behind silence. They feel storms before clouds appear. And because they feel so deeply, they often become responsible for problems they never created. They spend years trying to save relationships alone, trying to heal people who refuse healing, trying to understand behavior that should never have required understanding. Like a broken well endlessly pouring water into a desert, they give and give and give until there is almost nothing left. They become experts in forgiveness, experts in patience, experts in second chances, then third chances, then 10th chances. Not because they are weak, because they see possibilities where others see limitations. They see wounded children hiding inside destructive adults. They see fear behind cruelty, pain behind manipulation, loneliness behind arrogance. And because they can see these hidden layers, they stay longer than they should. Much longer. They build bridges for people who only burn them. They become shelters for people who arrive carrying hurricanes. They offer understanding to people who mistake compassion for permission. And slowly, almost invisibly, they lose themselves. Their anger gets buried. Their needs become negotiable. Their boundaries dissolve. Their identity fragments. Every sacrifice feels noble in the moment. But over time, those sacrifices accumulate like cracks spreading across a foundation, tiny fractures, barely visible, until one day the entire structure can no longer support the weight. This is where most people misunderstand the empath's journey. They expect a dramatic collapse, a breakdown, a confrontation, an explosion. But that is rarely what happens, because the real transformation begins with silence, a strange silence, a dangerous silence, a silence so quiet that almost nobody notices it when it arrives. Then comes the moment, the click, not an argument, not a fight, not revenge, just a single instant, a microscopic shift, like a lock turning inside a sealed room, like a receiver disconnecting from a signal it has listened to for years. Like a bridge collapsing so smoothly that no sound reaches the surface. Something simply stops. The empath looks at the same behavior, the same manipulation, the same promises, the same cycle, and suddenly feels nothing. Not hatred, not rage, not bitterness. Nothing. And that absence is what terrifies people. Because emotional manipulation depends on emotional access. The moment access disappears, control disappears with it. Imagine a leash being severed with one clean cut. The person holding it may continue pulling, but nothing moves anymore. The connection is gone. Irretrievable. Permanent. This is the moment many manipulators fail to recognize until it is far too late. They think they still have time. They think another apology will work. Another excuse. Another emotional performance. Another promise of change. But something irreversible has already occurred. The door has closed. Not slammed, closed, quietly, and that makes it infinitely more final. Hughes often explored how suppressed traits return stronger when denied expression. This is where shadow integration begins. Not as darkness, not as cruelty, but as wholeness. The empath finally meets the parts of themselves they abandoned. The anger they buried, the boundaries they feared, the standards they compromised, the voice they silenced, the instincts they ignored. The shadow arrives carrying gifts, and suddenly the traits once viewed as dangerous become essential. The ability to say no, the willingness to walk away, the courage to disappoint others, the strength to protect peace, the capacity to prioritize self-respect over approval. They didn't become cold, they became complete. The part they feared became the part that saved them. It is like discovering hidden fortress walls beneath a house that spent years standing exposed to storms. The walls were always there. They simply had never been used. Now they rise, stone by stone, boundary by boundary, truth by truth. And as those walls rise, something extraordinary happens. The people around them begin to panic. Not everyone, but the people who benefited from their self-abandonment, the people who depended on endless forgiveness, the people who relied on guilt, the people who thrived on confusion, because suddenly their old strategies stop working. Guilt no longer opens doors. Love bombing no longer creates attachment. Emotional pressure no longer produces compliance. The hooks find nothing to grab. The bait attracts no response. The signals reach no receiver. Imagine someone trying to unlock a house after every lock has been replaced. They still possess the old keys, but the keys are worthless now. And the confusion this creates can be profound. Manipulators often mistake empathy for weakness. They mistake patience for dependency. They mistake kindness for inability to leave. When the empath evolves, these assumptions collapse. And when assumptions collapse, panic follows. The manipulator begins escalating, trying harder, pushing more aggressively, becoming more dramatic. But every attempt only reveals the machinery that once operated unseen. The illusion shatters. The performance becomes obvious. The script becomes transparent. And once a person sees the strings controlling the puppet show, they can never truly unsee them. That is why unstoppable empaths seem mysterious. People assume they acquired new powers. In reality, they simply stopped ignoring what was already there. They stopped abandoning themselves. According to Jungian psychology, individuation is the process of becoming whole, the integration of fragmented pieces into a unified self, the end of internal civil war, the beginning of psychological sovereignty. And this is exactly what emerges. For the first time in their lives, the empath no longer needs external permission to trust their own reality. They no longer need consensus, validation, approval, agreement. Their internal compass becomes stronger than outside noise. This creates a kind of psychological immunity, not invulnerability. Immunity. There is a difference. Invulnerability suggests nothing can hurt you. Immunity means pain can enter, but it can no longer infect. The wound may exist, but the poison does not spread. The manipulation may occur, but it cannot establish control. The criticism may arrive, but it cannot redefine identity. This is the birth of emotional sovereignty, and it changes everything. There is a stillness that begins to appear, a calmness people struggle to understand, because it isn't passive. It isn't weakness. It isn't avoidance. It is the stillness of someone who no longer needs to prove anything, like a mountain that no longer argues with the wind, like an ocean that no longer negotiates with storms, like a secured fortress whose gates remain closed to invaders. The empath finally realizes that peace is not something granted by others. Peace is something protected, and protection requires boundaries. This realization creates radical acceptance, one of the most misunderstood forms of wisdom. Radical acceptance does not mean approving harmful behavior. It means seeing reality exactly as it is, without fantasy, without denial, without wishful thinking, without self-deception. The empath stops waiting for people to become who they promised they would become, stops waiting for accountability, stops waiting for awakening, stops waiting for transformation. And that acceptance becomes liberation. Because hope, when attached to illusion, can become a prison. The moment illusion dies, freedom begins. Many people fear this stage. They mistake it for cynicism. It isn't. They mistake it for bitterness. It isn't. They mistake it for emotional death. It isn't. It is emotional maturity reaching its final form. The shattered illusion becomes fertile ground for truth. And truth is where power lives. The years continue. The transformation deepens. Something remarkable happens. The empath begins attracting different experiences, different people, different opportunities, different relationships, not because the world changed, because they changed. The frequency changed. The standards changed. The boundaries changed. The access changed. The emotional architecture itself was rebuilt, like a house finally secured after decades of leaving every door unlocked. And perhaps the most unsettling part is how effortless it begins to feel. The things that once required struggle become automatic. Walking away, saying no, protecting energy, trusting intuition, maintaining standards. What once felt impossible becomes natural. The emotional armor forged in years of fire no longer feels heavy. It becomes part of them, not a burden, an extension. And eventually they arrive at a place few people understand. Indifference, not cruelty, not revenge, not punishment. Indifference, one of the most misunderstood states in human psychology, because true indifference is not emotional numbness. It is transcendence. It is reaching a level where someone's behavior no longer determines your inner state. Their approval means nothing. Their rejection means nothing. Their praise changes nothing. Their criticism changes nothing. You are no longer psychologically available for manipulation. And that freedom is breathtaking. They stop explaining, stop defending, stop convincing, stop chasing understanding, stop seeking validation from people committed to misunderstanding them. The need disappears, like an extinguished signal that no longer broadcasts into empty space. For years, they tried to be seen. Now they simply see themselves. For years, they begged for reciprocity. Now they provide loyalty to themselves. For years, they searched for permission. Now they embody authority. This is the final evolution, the sovereignty of self, the return home, the completion of a journey most people never realize they are taking. And perhaps this is why unstoppable empaths scare people later in life. Not because they become dangerous, because they become free. Free people are difficult to control. Free people are difficult to manipulate. Free people cannot be guilted into abandoning themselves. Free people recognize emotional traps before stepping into them. Free people understand that love without respect is not love. Compassion without boundaries is not compassion. Sacrifice without reciprocity is not virtue. And once these truths are learned deeply enough, they cannot be unlearned. The old version never returns. The bridge remains collapsed. The lock remains turned. The gate remains secured. The leash remains severed. The illusion remains shattered. And standing in the center of that transformed life is someone almost unrecognizable. Not because they became someone new, because they finally became who they were always meant to be. The years of suffering were never meaningless. The betrayals were never the ending. The disappointments were never the final chapter. They were the fire, the forge, the initiation, the painful process through which strength was revealed. Because in the end, they were never losing other people. They were recovering themselves, and the silence you hear now is not emptiness. It is not loneliness. It is not defeat. It is the sound of a soul no longer negotiating its worth. It is the sound of psychological wholeness. It is the sound of individuation completed. It is the sound of a person standing fully inside their own life for the very first time. They are no longer waiting to be chosen. They have already chosen themselves. And once an empath reaches that point, they do not become harder. They do not become darker. They do not become less loving. They simply become unreachable by anything that once required them to betray themselves. And that is why they become unstoppable, not because they conquered the world, because they finally conquered the part of themselves that believed they had to earn their right to exist. Now they know better. Now they know who they are. And once that knowledge becomes permanent, there is no going back.